Earlier, we created a simple animation using one keyframe rule, one CSS property, and a few animation properties. That was pretty neat, but there's still a lot more we can do with keyframe animations, especially when combined with transforms and configured with certain animation properties. We'll learn how in these next videos, where we'll have a little fun by creating a full-page CSS animation. I think you'll really enjoy this. Let's get started. So I've grabbed a couple of images from the Treehouse site. Here we have the tugboat, the Treehouse Island illustration, and our good buddy Mike the Frog, all designed by our awesome designers here at Treehouse. So we're going to have a little fun and create a CSS animation sequence with these images. In our HTML file, I've already added the image elements. The tugboat image is wrapped in a div with the class boat, and the main.css file, I've already added the island illustration to the body as a background image and positioned it so that the bottom of the island sits towards the top of the page, as we can see here. I've also resized and positioned the boat div with top and left offsets, and the width of the image is set to be 100% of the width of boat, so it's 380 pixels. And below that, I've also added an after pseudo element to the boat div, which simply displays a small background image of puffs of steam, which we'll be animating later to make it look like it's coming up from the steam engine of the boat. I've also positioned the Mike the Frog image off screen with absolute positioning, but we'll see Mike again in a bit. Finally, I applied a transformation with a Z rotation of -5 degrees. So this is what it's looking like in the browser. Next, we'll need to bring our elements to life with a few animations. We'll be creating our animations in a separate file named animations.css. So first up, let's go ahead and give our tugboat image here a back and forth rocking motion, and also have it slightly bobbing up and down so that it appears to be floating and moving in the water. So back in our CSS, we will go ahead and create a new keyframe rule. So we'll type @ and WebKit, since I'll be using Chrome throughout this, keyframes, and we will call this animation sequence rock boat. So inside, we will declare our keyframe declarations, starting with 0%. We'll also apply one at 50% and one at 100%. So in our 0% keyframe declaration, we will start off with a transform property where we will give it a rotate function, and we will follow that with translate y and the value 0. So in our 50% declaration, I'll just go ahead and copy these values and paste them in. I will make the WebKit transform rotate -5 degrees, and then we will have it translate -10 pixels. And finally, in our 100% rule, I will paste in the values from 0%. So the rotate function will give it that rocking motion, and translate y gives it that up and down bobbing movement. So next, let's bind this sequence to the boat selector so we can run it in the browser. So above it, we will select boat. We'll start by using the WebKit animation property. So in the previous video, we defined the animation name, duration, and timing function as 3 separate properties. But we can also define these using the animation shorthand property by space separating each value. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll first declare the animation name, which is rock boat, followed by an animation duration of 3 seconds. And we will give this a timing function of ease in out. So we will go ahead and save this and view it in the browser. When we refresh, there is our boat animation. It eases up and down as it rocks back. But we want the animation sequence to run more than once. Now, the default iteration cycle of a keyframe sequence is 1 cycle, but we can easily change that with the animation iteration count property. So in our boat rule below the animation property, we'll type WebKit animation iteration count. So with this property, we can set the number of times an animation cycle is played. By default, it will play 1 keyframe rule from beginning to end, and it stops. So the number value we define is the number of cycles it will play. So for example, if we set it to 2, it will run twice. If we set it to 3, it will run 3 times, and so forth. But we need our rock boat animation sequence to run infinitely so that it gives it this repetitive rocking and bobbing motion. Well, to do this, we can use the value infinite. So we'll save this and refresh. Now our boat animation cycles infinitely. So let's also include this infinite value in the shorthand property. We'll put it at the end here. And now we can remove the individual property. So we created our initial keyframe sequence using 3 keyframe declarations. But we don't actually need all 3. We can remove the 0% and 100% declarations because they're basically just reverting back to their default states of 0, which are the same as the computed values of the boat element, which has no rotation and no translation. And according to the animation spec, if a 0% keyframe isn't defined, the browser will create one using the computed values of the properties being animated. And the same happens if a 100% keyframe isn't defined. So we can actually just leave out 0 and 100% and keep the 50% declaration. And as we can see, nothing changes. It runs the same as before. So next, let's create the steam animation for our boat. So we will go ahead and create a new keyframe rule, and we'll call this one steam. Now, before we create our keyframes, let's set the default opacity of this steam pseudo element to 0. This way, we do not see it right away. So now we can see that our steam element is hidden. So back in the steam keyframe rule, we'll create a few keyframe declarations. We'll start with 0%, and we will give it an opacity value of 0. Next, we will combine 40% with 60, and we will give it an opacity of 1. Finally, in our 100% keyframe declaration, we will add a WebKit transform property where we will apply a translate, and we will make the x value negative 15% and the y value negative 35%. And we will follow this with a rotate z function where we will pass an argument of 20 degrees. So again, we can actually remove the 0% keyframe declaration because opacity 0 is now the default value of the element that will run this animation sequence. Now we can go ahead and bind this animation sequence to the selector and configure some of the animation options. So below our boat rule, we will select the after pseudo element and give it the animation property. We will reference the steam sequence and give it a 4-second duration. Now, the order of the time values is important in the shorthand property. Just like with the transition property, the first time value is assigned to the animation duration, and the second one is assigned to the animation delay. So here, the animation duration is 4 seconds, and the animation delay will be 2 seconds. So we'll leave the timing function alone so that it defaults to ease, and we will also give it an infinite iteration count. So let's run this in the browser. We'll refresh the browser, and there we see the steam animation sequence delayed by 2 seconds. Then it plays infinitely along with the rock boat animation.